Hey everybody, I'm Evan. Welcome to the ProfNoctis Show. This week we are talking about Fantasian Neo Dimension, a game that I managed to pronounce correctly on the first time. I'm really excited. Wade, we talk a lot about smell. What can we expect?
We talk a lot about the big question. Is this game a Final Fantasy? What is a Final Fantasy? And what does Sakaguchi say about Fantasian Neo Dimension and how it continues his legacy? So without further ado, let's get into it. Hey everybody, what's up? Today we are talking about Fantasian Neo Dimension, spoiler-free impressions as well as deeper discussions about the game. Huge thanks to Square Enix for providing me with a copy of this game. They knew that I love Final Fantasy, so this may be right up my alley. Even though this game had come out on the Apple Arcade, I never played it, but when it came to consoles, I was really excited to give it a try. However, playing this game has brought me back around to a core question, maybe the question that launched this entire channel. And before we get into any of that, Evan, you're new to the Final Fantasy fandom, and I want to pose this question to you. What is Final Fantasy?
Final Fantasy is the friends that we've made along the way.
Fair answer.
I think
you've made a lot of friends because of Final Fantasy at this point.
That's exactly it. I think that is the case, though. It's a sprawling franchise, and I'll get to this in a second. But I did have a conversation with someone who was explaining the show and what we did, and they had some questions about Final Fantasy. And if you've ever tried to explain the series to someone, it can take some twists and some turns. But I think I was introduced to the Final Fantasy fandom like a seal that was raised in captivity. Have you seen these videos? They get an animal, they rehabilitate it. You know, they're not going to release it into the wild unless it's going to be safe. If it can't survive on its own, they keep it in a zoo. But sometimes they bring it to the beach and they open the little crate door, and the animal, let's say it's a penguin, it waddles out and it stops and it's staring at the majesty of the ocean. And then I like to think behind those beady little eyes, it also starts to feel overwhelmed, a little bit of trepidation as the vastness of its new surroundings happens. And sometimes you'll see that animal slowly turn around and look back at the people who have been feeding it food, keeping it safe. And it's like, you want me to go out there? I'd rather stay here with you. And what I found was not an overwhelming ocean, but I found a very welcoming group of fellow penguins who taught me all the fun things about being in the ocean and why, yes, some aspects of these games may be overwhelming. Here's how to have fun with them, and here's how we can interact with them together. And so I would say my introduction to the Final Fantasy fandom has made me really appreciate it in a different light outside of just kind of the gameplay elements. And so when we get back to that question, what is a Final Fantasy? I think I'll probably toss one question back to you before I give my answer. When was the last time you tried to explain why and how the Final Fantasies are numbered to someone?
Oh, man. So I have to do that once a semester because I teach the class, and they're like, hey, if they're not connected, why are they numbered like that? And it's like, yeah, totally fair. It's more of an anthology. It's not really a linear sort of progression sort of thing. But yeah, that's a challenge. And, you know, the reason that I asked this question is because Fantasian is a game that is almost like a spiritual successor to Final Fantasy. And it is made by the creator of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi. And so while I'm playing this game, you know, it makes me ask the question, like, am I just playing a Final Fantasy game? If he had never left Square Enix, because Sakaguchi was responsible for Final Fantasy 1 in 1987 all the way through, I think it was Final Fantasy 9, but he may have been on Final Fantasy 10 as well. And I actually know this as
you can let us know in the comments.
Let us know in the comments. But, you know, we're kind of flying by the seat of our pants here. But he was the guy, the Final Fantasy guy for the first 10 or so of these games. And when he left Square Enix shortly after the CG movie Final Fantasy Spirits Within
Saw
came
that.
on, we've talked about this a little bit on the show. You saw it? Did you see it in theaters? See it on DVD?
So I saw it in theaters, but I understand that you took a first date to go see it.
Yeah, I took a date to Final Fantasy Spirits Within, first and last date. Believe it or not, she was not enthused. You know.
Did you tell her, like, when Sid came on, you're like, every game has a Sid.
Every game
has somebody named Sid. And she's like, oh, what are all these other things? Are these things also from the games? And you said, no.
No, none of that is. Then I leaned over. I was like, "You see those little strands? That's kind of like the life stream in Final Fantasy VII." And she was like, "We're not doing this anymore." Real talk. I also took a girl to see Tomb Raider in theaters.
Which,
the
like,
first one with Angelina Jolie.
Angelina Jolie one.
Yeah, like back in the day. And imagine. Like the different reviews. Like I was like, man, what a great movie. And she was like, this is over. So I mean, we could do like an entire episode on video games and the demise of relationship. Wouldn't that be fun?
Well, that's the video games and the demise of relationship is probably a meta commentary on our generation's like romantic experience for some folks. So yes, there is that. Yeah. But I also think when it comes to video game movies, there's probably a lot to talk about. We've been through the ringer on some good ones, some that have gotten better. It's an interesting situation, but it also, I think, goes to kind of that mainstream appeal where you have somebody who's interested in a franchise, and so there's going to be a natural audience for it. But I think that goes well into what we're talking about with Final Fantasy, in that they're naming and numbering them, even though they aren't sequential or they don't build on each other necessarily plot-wise. They want to make sure that you know that it's in that same lane. Like this is a Final Fantasy experience. And like you talked about in your video, I think the things for me that resonate with Final Fantasy are, a lot of the style, right? That's going to be some kind of party system. There's going to be relationships between the characters. There's going to be a very clear hero, whether or not they are like a good or a complicated hero or more of a pure hero. You get kind of these different hero characters. And I would probably say, with the advent of some of the voice acting, outside of our interpretation of the written text on the earlier ones, that sounded like almost biblical. Our interpretations of they get a little bit more personality. Whereas when you're reading it, you insert a little bit of personality, like you would in a book, around different characters. They kind of start to take on this more cinematic experience as the game goes on. So there is a turning point when you start to get into that. They get into it with 7, it was revolutionary, but then really 8, 9, 10, that really starts to get that kind of more cinematic experience. And then the visuals caught up with that cinematic experience, around probably Final Fantasy 13 would be the first one for me. 15 for sure was the first one that I looked at the graphics and went, okay, wow. I'm not like, I thought at first I was looking at a cutscene, because Final Fantasy has always been known for its great cutscenes. Them and Blizzard games, right? Their cutscenes were just amazing. They had these entire cinematic teams. It was awesome. And so when you look at the Final Fantasy games, there's this experience that's kind of gone through. So yes, the wrappings of it has changed, but it is that kind of hero, party, adventure, central focus. There's usually some kind of big evil, and sometimes they're a little more complicated. But it's been a fun experience to get to play some of the different ones, and then talk about Rebirth in the way that we did.
Right.
But it's confusing to explain to somebody else. It's difficult at times because it's like, well, how much time do you have? Which is not a great.
It's not a great start to initiate someone.
Right, exactly.
And this is what I do every single semester.
Yeah.
Right. In my Final Fantasy classes, I have to say, okay, so we're picking up with Final Fantasy 15, or we're picking up with Final Fantasy 16 last semester, or 7 remake and rebirth.
I am already. Literally, I know what all those things are, and I know your curriculum, and my brain, I just kind of fizzled when you were talking.
And so, what I say every single time is like, yes, this is a series. Think of it like an anthology, like a collection of stories. You don't have to play the first ones, but here is what you need to know about what a Final Fantasy is. And so we'll talk about kind of what you've already talked about. Final Fantasy has some core commitments to immersion. And that's one of the reasons why we do this in our recommendations.
Right.
Like we talk about the immersive quality of things. Squaresoft and Square Enix now have always been really committed to using the Final Fantasy brand to promote the greatest level of immersive storytelling. So you're
Mhm.
talking about they're always on the front end of graphics. This is why, even today, as of recording this, they have the PC version of Rebirth coming out, and it's remarkable. But again, it just shows their commitment to making it look and be presented the absolute best way possible.
The PC version looks crisp.
It looks really
I had to
crisp, and
stop watching it because I'm playing
I
on just
know.
regular PS5, and I was like,
Yeah,
I don't need to know what's on the other side of it. Because even the PS Pro, I
yeah,
would say the PC goes even above that as far as like
yeah.
visual fidelity.
Well, I just got the Rebirth for PC, so I'm probably gonna need to upgrade some specs. We can talk about that later.
I think you'll probably be okay. You're all right. You got it. It's that giant monitor you have that if you
It's
guys
the giant monitor that just ruins me. Everybody watching, listening, you can't see it because obviously I'm using it, but like I've got this widescreen, ultra wide monitor, and I don't know, it looks real pretty and
it
it
looks
looks
very
very
cool.
commanding.
It's very
The
cool.
problem is it's just like sapping all of the live stream from my little PC. And it like breaks down all the time for me. So I don't know.
We're getting a little bit better every year. You got this. You got this.
A
So when it comes
little
to
bit.
Fantasian,
So true.
I'm a little bit
Yeah.
curious how overt some of those elements were at the beginning of your experience. So,
So, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It does not immediately feel like a Final Fantasy from the Sakaguchi era,
okay,
in my opinion.
okay, time
Yeah.
out. So before we get into like that feel, tell me a little bit about the path for how this game got made and why
Yeah.
people think it's a spiritual successor. Because I'll give you my understanding, and you just
Yeah.
correct me a little bit. So he directed these games, and then he kind of had his own studio or a different studio, and
Yeah.
made similar types of games that he was because he was the game director for
Well,
or
let
the
me explain it.
creator.
Actually, Eurogamer.net published an interview with Sakaguchi just last week, January 21st. So this is current cutting edge sort of
Wow.
information. And so they kind of go through it in their article where they say that this is something of a full circle moment for Sakaguchi. He was the creator who left Square Enix back in 2003 and founded his own studio called Mistwalker, where he's since continued making RPGs. Fantasian was released in 2021, but it remained exclusive to Apple Arcade until last year's re-release, published by Square Enix. So for Sakaguchi to recall it, he says it almost feels nostalgic, as though you're going back to a high school reunion of sorts,
I'm
which I
getting
can imagine. Like,
yeah.
you have this kind of public rift between the two. And I don't know all the details of
Yeah,
that, but it was
sure.
like he was the Final Fantasy guy, and now he's not. And so he's creating these new RPGs that feel like spiritual successors in a lot of ways to that original legacy. Um,
Well, I want to talk about that later, maybe closer to
mhm.
the end, about as this franchise grows and expands,
Yeah.
how all these different creators are going to kind of make these epic games that take forever to make. I mean, these are like
Yeah.
digital cathedrals almost of
Yeah.
time that get invested into these games. So when it comes to Fantasian, would did you see that immediately? It was pretty clear that this was an experience that you had come to expect from some of your earlier Final Fantasy days. Tell me how you
Sure.
felt when you loaded it up and got into it.
Well, the first thing that I noticed was the music, which makes sense because Uematsu created the music for this game, famed Final Fantasy composer. From 1 to, I think he finished up with 11 and then came back for certain tracks in 14, um, a DLC in 15, and then a little bit for 16 as well, and certainly 7 and 7 Rebirth. Um, so the first thing that I noticed was the music feels Final Fantasy because it feels Uematsu,
Okay.
the composer, right? And so that was my immediate impression. The second thing, they are doing some really interesting things immersively for the game. For example, a vast majority of all of the maps in the game, like the gameplay areas that you're running through, they are handcrafted dioramas. Okay. Yeah, handcrafted dioramas where a camera is kind of sweeping around them, and you've got characters that are. It's It is wild to look at. And I've been streaming the game over on Twitch and YouTube, and like it is the chat is just like, this is really, really wild. And we're just marveling over the intricacy. Because I
Yeah.
mean, you look at some of these dioramas, because you've got like there's some screenshots in video, like how they did it behind the scenes sort of
Oh
things.
yeah.
It is phenomenal what they've done. And so it's just a different way of kind of telling the story. But what they're trying to do with this, I think it's so smart. During the PS1 era, Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9,
Yeah.
you had these static pre-rendered backgrounds.
Yeah.
That were CG generated, but they're very, very meticulous and beautiful. And you would have your 3D models kind of going through these backdrops. Well, what they decided to do with Fantasian was create physical backgrounds, and then what they're able to do with the camera is actually move it and shift it. So what was once a static background is now very active and vibrant. Oh, it's really, really cool.
It really seems like like a set on a play. Like they changed the stage completely behind, and it's like inserting one and doing the other rather than feeling like you're traveling from like area to area. It's like you're moving between acts and scenes of a play in person. Does the story beat kind of match that kind of feel?
Yeah, it really does. So the story beat, you're always going to get a like a hero character, a party, the interplay between or among those, and then there's some kind of world crisis. Now, in my video, I really talk about this, and like this is my thesis. A lot of people can disagree with me on this, or say it's too vague and too simple. But one of the key core elements of being a Final Fantasy is that there is an end to an oppressive cycle.
Yeah,
and that's why it's called Final Fantasy, I think, thematically. Because in the first game that you play, Final Fantasy 1, you realize that this journey has happened before, and it's like the antagonist calls a time loop, but the time that you're playing is the final version of that time loop where you ended. It's the Final Fantasy. And to some degree, all 16 of these games are putting an end to an oppressive cycle. In Fantasian Neo Dimension, that sort of sense of oppressive authority, history that is doomed to repeat itself is present. But just from a vibe standpoint, it really just feels like, you and your party heroes journeying through the narrative of the game. So, I'm not entirely sure that it's like the truest of Final Fantasy, but it definitely feels of it. So
it's in the spirit. I mean,
it's in the spirit.
There's not much that would have to change about it to just label it as a Final Fantasy. So that gives it
the name.
It's definitely in the sub niche of like the role playing games. You have your RPGs, and then you have your Japanese role playing games, your JRPGs. So then you would have this kind of Final Fantasy segment that kind of spins off of it. I hadn't really thought much about, for lack of a better term, no pun intended, but the finality of each of these stories, that they do complete themselves. A lot of games leave their endings extremely open-ended because they want to take an IP and they want to have multiple games, and so the characters are going to go and they're going to have another story that they go on. But these Final Fantasy games really do tie up. They're like, this is the story that we told with these characters, and now we're going to tell a new story with new characters. And I think there's a lot to be said there. I think it's challenging commercially at this point because people get attached to certain characters, but I think the risk-taking in the storytelling department and their commitment to that, I think, is commendable. So this idea that even if you're not at Square Enix developing Square Enix games, that you would be making games in this kind of Final Fantasy lane makes me really curious about some of the future of this type of game. Do you think we're going to get more Final Fantasy type games as these different game directors branch out and as game development kind of changes? Sometimes the expenses are a little low. You've got some indie startups that are starting to make some kind of JRPG Final Fantasy games. It's an interesting spot. And where does Fantasian fit in that mix? And is this the start of a trend, or is this kind of a one-off because he made 9 or 10 Final Fantasy games, or 6, I think 7 really is what we're talking about, Final Fantasy games, and we don't know. Which way are we headed here?
I think it's hard to say. It is a credit to Final Fantasy as a franchise that it's kind of, even today, with a little bit of an identity crisis, it's still the standard bearer.
Yeah.
With JRPGs. Dragon Quest, as we've mentioned on a couple episodes back, is world-renowned and famed. However, it doesn't have that international, worldwide appeal that Final Fantasy always has. And so Final Fantasy is the one that's always pushing that next thing. So I think it's to the franchise's credit that everybody seems to be chasing that same lightning in a bottle sort of moment. Now, I'm not saying that Fantasian is doing that by any means, because, I mean, the guy created Final Fantasy. He's simply creating out of, what he is. But funny story, Sakaguchi was once asked, what is Final Fantasy? And his first sort of response was, if you ever have a blue text box with white text in it, that's a Final Fantasy, because that was the standard of the first six, right?
That he gets it.
He gets it. That's what a Final Fantasy is. And that's why we are filled with a little bit of nostalgia when we see in 7 or 7 Rebirth or Remake, just those classic blue text boxes and that little bleep, bleep.
That's why Super Mario RPG was so great, because that's like, this is just Final Fantasy with
This is
Mario
Final Fantasy.
Guys.
And there was a Final Fantasy boss in it.
This is the Mario guys.
That's it. It's Mario Fantasy 7. But when he was really pressed on it, he has this really eloquent sort of thing. So I'm reading from Kotaku's 2014 article, What Final Fantasy Is According to Its Creator. Here's what he says. He says, Final Fantasy is what is born after those who live intensely run across a multitude of unbeaten paths to reach the same goal in the end. After all, we've always strived to do new things, and I'd like it if we kept doing that. So this has a double entendre.
That's the most Final Fantasy character answer
I know,
to
right?
that question I've ever heard.
Of course.
Perfect.
It's great because he first says, the first meaning of it is for the characters themselves, right? I mean, they are running intensely, living intensely across a multitude of unbeaten paths to reach this same goal. And that really is that idea of we are going to fight against this oppressive system and stuff. I think that is the hearkening theme throughout Final Fantasy. But the second thing, and he really gets it to the heart of it, in his little addendum there, we've always strived to do new things, and I'd like it if we kept doing that. He's talking about the developers. We're living intensely and running a multitude of unbeaten paths to reach that same goal, to tell this story that's never been told like this before. And that's why they have this preoccupation, I believe, with we want to be cutting edge graphics. We want to have innovation in gameplay. That's why we have different battle systems every time. We want to have the best voice acting, the most unforgettable soundtrack. And with Rebirth, we were talking before the show, I think they've done it with that, just the sheer variety.
That was really
They're
good.
trying to do as much as they can with this in untreaded waters, unbeaten, uncharted waters moving forward. I think it's cool to think in those terms.
We think about visual style and how visual style and sound design can help us feel like we're immersed in the game or in the environment or in the movie. But video games make you feel a way when you're interacting with them, the way that you control the story, the way that the story is brought to you. So when you're holding the controller in your hand and you're playing the game, did you just kind of feel caught up with it? Like, did you find yourself relaxing into it and understanding like where your expectations needed to lie? I know that something like this is probably going to happen, but then at the same time, the way that they've tweaked this visual style, tell me about that feel of playing it.
First of all, I should say that I was playing on stream. I've exclusively played this game so far on stream, and so that is a different experience than me just like cuddled up on a couch or whatever, playing it. But even so, whether it's the battle system or certain narrative beats, I'm like, oh man, like this is filling me with a new nostalgia. Case in point, we're on, I say we, me and the chat. So viewers, you were with me. We're on a ship that's going across the sand. Okay, it's a sand ship, as we might have in the real world. And we're going across these sand dunes. And I was like, my bet is we're going to have some giant Leviathan fight here, because I've never been on an old Final Fantasy ship without a Leviathan attack.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
And what happens? A giant sand Leviathan worm comes out and attacks us. I was like,
Perfect.
what do I know Final Fantasy? That's right.
It's perfect. Hey, I can't help but notice your sweater. Speaking of Final Fantasy, let me see this thing.
Yeah.
What you
A
got
product
here?
placement. So we've got the Muthos Logos sweater here. Sorry, I have to do squats in order to get that thing.
You don't like squats, so
You know me. So yeah, I had this made for my class for Final Fantasy 16
it looks
Muthos
great.
Logos. It's really fun. So I'm dolling it up with the like Oxford
It's perfect. It's
button down
perfect.
underneath. Like feeling very professorial today.
So the Sand Leviathan, that's on me. That's on me. Getting us out.
Oh,
So the
good. Good
Sand
diversion.
Leviathan comes in, and so you
Now
knew.
available on the merch shop.
There
Everybody.
you go. So check it out if you want your Mythos Logos
Yeah.
sweater. So the Sand Leviathan comes out. You know kind of what to expect. So
Yeah.
you're feeling that, but there is this subversion of
That's
your
it.
expectations with the visual style. And did you feel like it was a little maybe unmoored in a good way, where because it wasn't an official Final Fantasy, in the back of your mind you're saying at any point this can go a different direction?
Well, that was it. It was like, okay, well, I'm on a ship, but Leviathan is not a sand creature. It's a sea creature. So it's interesting that they are, rooting it in these classic tropes, but subverting it all at the same time.
It's
So it's
nice.
like it's a misdirect because it's like, oh, you know what this is, but let's show you a different way of doing it. I think it's a really fun and smart way of playing with some of these JRPG tropes, especially Final Fantasy tropes.
Yeah, it reminds me of a TV show where you think you know what it's about, and then you
Yeah.
look away or zone out for half a second, and then realize you need to rewind 3 or 4 minutes because you missed a twist or a turn early on in the show, and you got to kind of backtrack a little bit. I am curious about this phrase that you said, that it created a new nostalgia. You said it created a new nostalgia, so it helped you look at something that you really loved, but it pulled from something that was meaningful from your past to get there. And it took advantage of, your experience with this kind of franchise in order to give you something new and good. I thought that was an interesting way to say that, a new nostalgia. Can you talk a little bit more about what that experience was like and what you mean by that?
Yeah. So it reminds me a little bit of what one of our research assistants, shout out to Smith, Smithy Annam,
Shout out
who
Smith.
does amazing work for us. But he and I were talking yesterday on X, where he said, nostalgia is taken from the Greek of homesickness. And it's the idea of this longingness for home.
Mm-hmm.
And so nostalgia is really more about, there's a sense of home that reminds us of comfort, familiarity. And this game does that in a really interesting way. I can go back and play Final Fantasy Pixel remasters, and I can immediately get that sense of home, but I know all the beats, ultimately. I'm just revisiting. This, however, is able to take that same sort of feeling of home from those original Final Fantasy games and kind of reorient it, reiterate it in a newness that I think is really fresh and exciting in a way that not even Remake and Rebirth do necessarily. Because those are just going back and you are getting all of this amazing nostalgia. This, however, is a brand new story where it's revisiting tropes and story beats in a lot of ways that are expected and then subverted.
It is an interesting thing to think about in the context of visual media that you interact with. We talk about video games as something that you can control and they're tactile, but they're not something that you can smell and taste, right? So you can feel them with the controller vibrating, but they also say that there's a significant amount of nostalgia that's rooted specifically in the sense of smell, in the way that
I'm so glad that you said this. Because Fantasian Neo Dimension has a wild preoccupation with the sense of smell. And like, if you have watched any of my, viewers, if you've watched any of my streams, you know that whenever any of the characters say, it smells like, I'm like, what is the deal with the smell thing? And so we have talked about smell rooted in, memory rooted in smell. And so we've had some interesting discussions about, has a smell ever taken you back and rekindled memories? There's this one moment in the game, we're in the forest, and one of the characters, Kina, says, the smell of the forest is kind of returning. And then you go into this storybook presentation of her childhood. And it's just this idea of like the smell conjured up these memories with some amnesiac protagonists.
We can't be far away from having some scent. I know that they've been experimenting with it for decades to have some sort of like scentscape that can happen with like movies and games.
And like the PlayStation, Sony is experimenting with this right now. I don't know how much that's going to be great or whatever. Because, like, I mean, think about their games, like The Last of Us. Do you really want to smell the putrid, decaying flesh of like fungal monsters?
I do. I think maybe we should start, somewhere more like an Astrobot, like. Something a little more, Infinity Nikki, let's get those smells in here. Like Overcooked, the smells of cooking.
Overcooked, maybe.
Let's maybe. I don't think the launch title for the new Smell-O-Vision hardware is going to be Last of Us or God of War. You just smell Kratos and the dogs the whole time.
Yeah.
No things. But so when we talk about nostalgia, so it's describing that in its story to make sure that So I think that's a really creative way to engage the senses, and the only way they know how. But they're setting up the framework of what it smells like on a consistent basis. Because you can see what it looks like, you can see you can hear how it sounds, but you're going to rely on the characters to describe the vibe, the feel, the setting, and then the smell. So that's very interesting that it does that consistently.
It's enough that it's not like a cursory noticing smell.
Sure.
Like there's a smell reference probably every 5 minutes of gameplay. Like it is very, very heavy-handed, which I was not expecting. Who would?
Yeah, I don't know.
Like, I know I'm unique. I wasn't expecting that. I'm sure you all.
Yeah. Come play Fantasian. The game's so obsessed with olfactory that you just can't quite understand it.
I started playing this game shortly after. Did you hear about the University of Cambridge PhD thesis from Ali Lukes? The politics of olfactory senses.
I would love to. I'd love to know more.
It's a fascinating sort of PhD. She was hit with a lot of critique, saying, this is a worthless PhD.
Get her on the show. Let's get her on the show.
Oh man, how cool would that be? But the title of it is called "Olfactory Ethics: The Politics of Smell in Modern and Contemporary Prose," and the basis of it is kind of how smell can determine all kinds of it's not really determining, it's more a descriptor and even some ethical dilemmas based on racism, poverty, classism, a lot of different things. But she did this entire PhD on smell, the sense of smell. So she was an immediate follow for me on Twitter because I was like, I just gotta hear her impression of the world. Like that's a lens I have never thought about. But and then Fantasian comes out, and I'm like, I need to get Ali Lukes to play Fantasian.
So I think it's great. I mean, I can't wait to go check that out. So as you smelled your way through the game, you're finding it familiar, but it's cultivating this new nostalgia. When it comes to the future of Final Fantasy and then the future of this lane, right? Because Final Fantasy opened a door, right? Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, it opened a door to something new. And now people are playing in that space. It created the playground. It built the fence around it. But now these kids that have played on this playground, they're growing up and they're making their own playgrounds and they're looking at the fence and saying, that was good for then, but like we don't need that here now. The world has changed around our playground, and they're creating new experiences and new ways to play based on these similar values that they've been taught by these creators who've made these games. And so as we walk into this new season and you have more creators than ever making these kind of games, the game director is going to take years and years to make a game. So they're only going to be able to make realistically, and game director, sorry if you're listening to this, you're only going to have a certain number of games in your life that you're going to be able to make because of the amount of time it takes, right? So I would imagine that a lot goes into the creation of these games, the telling of these stories, and there's a strong commitment to them being excellent there, which I think is what's really appreciated by the fandom. But now that we're getting more and more and they're adventuring out in these different spaces, you get some of it in Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy 15, where you can drive around open world, that was pretty radical. Like, it was different. And people, some people really didn't like it. And some people really loved it. So you're getting these new spaces. And I think it's probably good that they're not all necessarily going to be Final Fantasies. Yeah. But I'm curious as to your thought as somebody who's a little more immersed in kind of the life of these stories that they're telling.
So I think that with all of the RPGs that are coming out, they are rooted in kind of this path that was first charted by Final Fantasy. I see it as I am playing through and coming to the climax of Metaphor. I'm like, man, there's a lot that is kind of owed back to Final Fantasy, and certainly its predecessors like Persona as well. But like, this is a great interpretation of what they felt was successful and effective about the Final Fantasy franchise. You see it with even games like The Witcher, or we brought in Momiji Studios, video game Fables. There's Final Fantasy-esque elements in all of that. Yeah. What I love about each one of these iterations is that they are in some ways sharing their interpretation of what a strong, solid RPG is. And for most of them, that was forged by Squaresoft back in the 80s and 90s, during the heyday of their creation and recreation considerably of this. So when you ask somebody, what is a Final Fantasy, you're going to get as many different answers as people you ask.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what's really cool about the RPG space now. People are taking the things that they really believe are the most immersive and most powerful qualities of these types of games and saying, this is the kind of fantasy that I want to live into. So I don't know. Like, I don't mean to say that everything is a Final Fantasy, but right. I do think that it's such again, standard bearer that everybody's kind of like, what's the thing about that I personally want to capture?
Yeah, I think it's, if I can be direct, when we talk about things that we enjoy, especially with video games, we're trying to examine them. It's really easy to talk about them like for example, Final Fantasy invented story, or they invented words.
Yeah.
That's not true, right? Obviously,
it's not that.
But we're just trying to understand it and look at it from some different lenses and try and break it apart to understand the different layers that make it work or not work, right? So Final Fantasy was one of the first strong commercial successes, which then, when you're commercially successful in our world, people pay attention to it. So when you tell a good story and you're commercially successful, that's kind of that combination that really gains a lot of momentum. So as we kind of wrap up,
well, let me say this to that point. This is not the only sort of medium where this sort of thing happens. I mean, in the United States, we look at things like the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and Bill of Rights, and we're like, oh, we created freedom and democracy and fairness. Well, we didn't, right? There was the Magna Carta in the late 1200s, and that was a heavy inspiration for some of these founding documents for America. And in the same way, Final Fantasy didn't create stories, didn't create words, but it did set an interesting template that has allowed people to say, okay, I'm going to take some things from that.
That's perfect. So as you experience the template, you're saying that it creates a sense of new nostalgia for this experience, and you want to play it more rather than this has already been done. We don't need to look backwards. We only need to look forwards on the new graphics, the new this. I think the creative twist on the gameplay elements and the stylized nature of this game makes it nest in a place that they're going for ageless appeal, but a timeless look, where you're not going to be able to know when this game was made. Sometimes with cutting edge games, they look amazing when they're cutting edge, but the cutting edge game, unless it's like stylized, especially if they're going for realism, is going to look dated faster than like a stylized game like that.
But don't you think we're getting to the point where it's not going to be like that? I mean, we're going to maybe look back and be like, oh man, those games are so old, they don't have smell. right?
Yeah,
Because like they all
yes, great point. That's a great point. I don't, but it's exciting. I really am grateful to get to exist in this space where I can like I don't even have to go to the store. I can just enjoy these stories and these experiences. And I think I'd love to hear your kind of closing thoughts on how momentous it is that they kind of have joined back together to publish this game in the way that they did. Because I think that's the thing that could, like, in the context gets a little bit lost, is that this is a bit of a return.
It is,
and it's not overt, but it shows almost a mending of maybe something that I'm not super aware of.
I just love a good happy ending, right? I like when all the characters and all the people just come back together. What I love most about this is that, yes, Sakaguchi is working with Uematsu and Square Enix / Squaresoft, but also Fantasian Neo Dimension was announced on a Nintendo Direct. And I think the greatest, like, divorce in my life was when Squaresoft and Nintendo parted ways. It just felt like a betrayal to me. And I bought a PlayStation, but I was like, man, Nintendo is like it's your boo, baby.
We were really
go back home.
We were resentful that we had to buy memory cards. That was the real that was the real fuss. Because
what a scam.
We started playing it, and then it was like, all right, you want to save your game, you have to get a memory card. And we're sitting there having made progress in the game. Like, could you put this on the box bigger for us? Or can you write a letter to my mom?
It was the Wild West back in the day.
Because as a kid, it's like getting them to buy
your parents didn't know, and you barely knew.
Right.
So.
They get you to buy the game, and then it's like, hey, I want you to buy this game. It's $40, $50, $60 at the time. And then you're like, you realize you need the memory card, and it's another $20. And so to have to be like, Mom, I really need this. I nearly need the memory card. You already bought me the console. We already have a television. You already bought me the game. I also need them. Then at that point, they ask you, well, what else is there going to be? And you're like, I promise nothing else. And then you're like, just the DX Racer Final Fantasy VII chair.
I need it to play the game, you see.
Right.
I need it.
I need it. I have to have it to play the game. Well, I'm glad that you're having a great experience with the game. And, I'd love to hear, those kind of wrap up thoughts as we chat about what is going on for the rest of this semester.
Yeah. So as we kind of close out with this, again, huge thanks to Square Enix for providing a copy of Fantasian Neo Dimension for PlayStation 5. For me to review, I'm having the best time with it, and I know the chat is enjoying it as well. For the rest of the semester, we are shifting gears shortly. In the coming weeks, you can expect us to begin our Last of Us lecture series, and that's going to include some episode analysis recaps that will be released on Mondays. On Tuesday nights, we'll do a Last of Us lecture play of the specific episode that corresponds to the HBO Max. I guess it's just called Max now. Episode. We'll do that weekly for season 1, even though it aired a couple years ago, as we prepare for season 2, which will begin in April. So that's going to be the kind of thing. Weekly show will be released on Wednesdays, and then on Thursdays and Fridays, we're going to have a number of things regarding Final Fantasy Fridays, stuff like that, and likely Thursday night playthroughs of Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy adjacent games, like Fantasian Neo Dimension.